These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? Again, black's king seems to have breathing room, so a back rank mate doesn't come to mind right away, but that freedom of movement can disappear in a hurry. Notice that if white plays queen moves to c6, his queen cuts off the king's flight squares to the left and right, b7 and d7, just as the pawn did in the previous study. This should cause you to look for heavy pieces that would be able to descend to the 8th rank, and thus find the threat of rook moves to a8, checkmate. To avoid that outcome, black has to play queen takes queen, but now white recaptures using his d5 pawn, which ends up on c6 and again seals off b7 and d7. This time black's only way of avoiding rook moves to a8, checkmate, is to move his king to b8 where it can defend a8 itself. But then white plays his other rook from f1 to a1, giving the rook on a7 some backup. He will mate next move no matter what black does. Again, the lesson is to notice how advanced pieces and pawns can abruptly trap the king on the back rank and allow it to be mated there. A piece on the 6th rank that seals off squares on the 7th can be mighty powerful. White to move. What is the best move? Drawing defenders forward. When the enemy king's position is well fortified, a sacrifice may be needed to loosen it up. Perhaps the most common sort of fortification is a rook next to the king with cover in front of it, typically as a result of castling. A classic way to remove such a rook is by sacrificing a heavy piece on the square in front of it, pulling the rook up off the back rank. There are various ways to then finish the sequence. The first, which we consider now, involves then throwing two coordinated rooks at the enemy king's position. In this first example, black's king seems well protected, his rook on d8 protects the back rank. But white has a battery directed down the d-file, suggesting that the d8 rook might be drawn forward and out of position. First comes a sacrifice on the square in front of it, one queen takes bishop, check. Rook takes queen, to prevent white from playing queen takes rook, checkmate. Now 2. Rook moves to e8, check. Forces black's rook back to d8, and now it is pinned to its king with rooks aimed at it from two directions. White mates by playing rook takes rook with either of his rooks. Black to move. What is the best move? See how the current idea works here. White's king looks secure, it is protected by its rook. If black drops a rook or queen onto the first rank, white can either capture it with his rook or leave his rook where it is and perhaps create a flight square by moving his h-pawn forward. But black can change all this with a sacrifice on the square in front of white's rook. Queen takes at f2, check. This threatens queen takes rook, checkmate. With cover from the rook on f8, so white has to play rook takes at f2. Now white's back rank is bereft of defenders. True, white can return his rook there, and he indeed must do so in reply to black's next move, rook moves to a1, check. But once white replies rook moves to f1, he is in the same position black suffered in the previous frame. Here black has two rooks with clean lines to the square next to white's king, with one able to provide protection for the other, so black plays rook takes rook with either rook and mates. Black to move. What is the best move? Notice that while white's position is slightly different here, his king is tucked into the corner, black's resources are arranged the same way as in the last position. He has a queen and rook trained on the square in front of white's rook, and another rook, this time on the b file, ready to drop to the back rank once the file is cleared. So play proceeds the same way. Black starts with queen takes at g2, check. White is required to play rook takes queen, black plays rook moves to b1, check. Forcing white's rook to interpose back on g1, and then black mates with rook takes rook. White to move. What is the best move? You see the concentration of three heavy white pieces aimed at f7, the question is how to take advantage of it. Not with rook takes at f7, black then has queen takes rook f1 plus, which loses his queen to queen takes queen but then allows him rook takes rook at the other end of the board and he has 1-2 rooks for his queen. The general idea was right, try to bait black's castled rook forward. But the beauty of a queen sacrifice for the purpose is that it gives check, keeping the position under tight control. Thus 1. Queen takes at f7, check. Rook takes queen, and now 2. Rook moves to c8, check. White mates with one rook or the other, after black tries useless interpositions with his c6 bishop and then with rook moves to f8. White to move. What is the best move? Now a variation on the current logic. Exchanging on d7 in front of black's back rank rook doesn't work, but white looks for any checks he can give and finds one. Queen takes knight. If black recaptures with his d7 rook, the resulting pattern should look familiar from the last few studies. White then plays rook takes rook d8 plus, forcing black's other rook to interpose at c8, and now white mates by playing rook takes rook with either of his rooks. Notice that black does no better by replying to the original one. Queen takes knight, check. By moving his king to 8, because then white mates with 2. Queen takes rook d8 plus, rook takes queen, 3. Rook takes rook, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? The role of the bishop pinning defenders. Our studies so far in this chapter mostly have neglected the bishop, making the back rank mate seem mostly a pattern executed with heavy pieces. But the bishop can fill several large supporting roles. The first is a variation on the pattern just considered. Once an enemy rook is drawn forward from the back rank with a sacrifice, it may become pinned on its new square by one of your bishops and thus make a back rank mate possible. The pattern can arise naturally after the enemy castles because his rook then will be right next to his king. This means that if the rook steps forward one square to recapture, it will be aligned diagonally with the king and prey to a pin. It's best of all if the bishop that will impose the pin already is in place, since then you can follow up with a back rank attack without any loss of time. In the example to the left, white has a bishop on the diagonal running toward the black king's position on g8, the bishop already pins the pawn on f7. White's standard sacrifice on the square in front of black's rook queen takes at f7, check. Forces the rook to step forward with rook takes queen and so to pin itself to its king. If black instead moves his king, then of course white mates with queen takes rook. Now the rook is immobilized and black's back rank is defenseless against white's rook moves to e8, checkmate. Black to move. What is the best move? The classic execution of the current idea starts with the queen and bishop both aimed at the pawn on f7 or, against white, f2, the edge of the castled king's pawn cover. Black has the formation here just as white did in the previous position. The difference is just that black's queen comes in from the side instead of attacking down the f-file. The result is the same. Black starts with queen takes at f2, check. Forcing the reply rook takes queen to prevent immediate mate, but now white's rook is pinned and his back rank is open for black's rook moves to d1, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? We have seen that the queen can make its sacrifice on f7 or a comparable square by swooping in horizontally or vertically. Here it follows a diagonal path. White's battery of queen and bishop alone here would not be enough to mate. The important thing to see is the combination of those pieces with the rook on the open A file. Queen takes at f7, check. Forces rook takes queen, and now again the rook is pinned. Rook moves to a8, check. Mates after black makes useless interpositions, that nevertheless are good to notice, with his queen and bishop. White to move. What is the best move? White has the familiar powerful coordination of his pieces, a queen and bishop trained on the key square at the corner of the king's pawn cover, c7. Here as before, this isn't enough to mate by itself. But there is more, a rook on the f-file. So the queen and bishop can be used to extract and then pin the queen that guards black's back rank. One queen takes at c7, check. Queen takes queen and now 2. Rook moves to f8, checkmate. Follows. White to move. What is the best move? This position looks like the usual setup for a back rank mate, starting with a sacrifice to draw the black defender of the rank forward. White has a queen and bishop both aimed at g7, and a rook available to follow up, so the natural idea is 1. Queen takes at g7, check. Queen takes queen, and now the rook mates with rook moves to f8. What's wrong with this idea? Never forget to consider possible interpositions, even when the attacking pieces are as snugly arranged against the king as we find here. Black can reply to rook moves to f8, check. With bishop moves to g8, and now white will be losing a piece for a pawn. White to move. What is the best move? The role of the bishop too, preventing a recapture. As long as we're considering contributions the bishop can make to a back rank mate, let's look at another role it can play. It can defend a piece delivering mate against capture by the enemy king. If you just counted up white's heavy pieces in the diagram and imagined them trying to mate, you would come up short. He has an impressive looking battery of 2 rooks and a queen on the f-file, but black has 2 defenders of his own on the back rank, and black's king is standing next to the mating square, f8, and so appears able to defend itself by taking the last white attacker to land there. But not really, because the white bishop on c5, while not a threat to do anything on the back rank itself, can protect the last white piece to land on f8 and so provide the finishing touch to a mate. It goes 1. Queen moves to f8, check. Rook takes queen, 2. Rook takes rook, check. Queen takes rook, 3. Rook takes queen, checkmate. Because the king can't recapture. Looking back at the original position, you can see that white had a decisive 4-3 advantage against black in their contest over f8. White to move. What is the best move? When you consider an attacking sequence, you want to see all the pieces that you and your opponent have bearing on it, including pieces aimed in the right direction with or without obstructions in their way. Here that means seeing not only the obvious back rank mating idea for white but also the black bishop on c5 and the white bishop on a3. The black bishop tells you that while the battery of rooks on the e-file looks formidable, it isn't quite enough to mate by itself. While black only protects the e8 square once, he has an interposition with bishop moves to f8. Yet white's bishop on a3 makes the idea work after all, since it permits his rook to capture on f8 with impunity. Thus 1. Rook moves to e8, check. Knight takes rook, 2. Rook takes knight, check. Bishop moves to f8, 3. Rook takes bishop, checkmate. The white bishop serves to prevent a recapture by black's king. As you look at the original position here, notice the way white's bishop attacks f8 through the black bishop that stands in its way. This is known as an X-ray. White to move. What is the best move? White is considering rook takes at h5. Would black be able to recapture with his queen, or would he be scared off by the thought that white then has queen takes queen? The point to notice about queen takes queen for white is that it removes his queen from his first rank, where his king is stuck, and meanwhile black has a rook on an open file that can drop to the back rank with rook moves to c1. Look for white's reply to that move and you see rook moves to f1, interposing his rook, but then notice as well black's bishop on a6, which then permits black to play rook takes rook, checkmate. So the initial idea rook takes at h5 is made unsafe for white by the bishop all the way over on a6, a study in how pieces that seem disconnected may have tightly interrelated interests. The possibility of a back rank mate easily can create connecting possibilities of these sorts, because its workings can be dramatically affected by the comings and goings of pieces from different points along the rank and in different directions. A more specific lesson of the case is that a bishop aimed next to the enemy king should not be underestimated. It may not be able to attack anything there by itself, but it can provide cover for a heavy piece on the square that may arrive in any of several ways. Black to move. What is the best move? Both queens are under attack. Rook takes queen doesn't work for black, as it is met with knight takes queen, and then the knight guards e1. But meanwhile the convergence of black's queen and bishop on g2 obviously suggests an attack on that square with queen moves to g2, check. But then white has queen takes queen. Don't give up with that observation, however, notice what pattern it leaves behind and think from there. Suddenly, a. White's king is stuck on the back rank and, b. Black's rook at e8 has an unobstructed path to e1. Play it through, rook moves to e1, check. Has to be met with queen moves to f1, and now black mates with rook takes queen, with his bishop on h3 providing cover for the rook that delivers the mate. From the outset of this position the bishop's ability to support an attack on g2 is obvious. Less obvious, but important, is its ability to support mate with a heavy piece on f1. Black to move. What is the best move? The role of the bishop 3, driving back the king. We have seen two useful roles a bishop can play in creating a back rank mate. It can pin a defender of the back rank after it has been pulled forward with a sacrifice, and it can provide cover for a heavy piece that lands next to the enemy king so that the king can't capture it. Now consider still another use. A bishop can attack an enemy king and thus drive the king further back behind its pawn cover where it can't reach a heavy piece that lands on the back rank. The position to the left may not look like the stuff back rank mates are made of, but watch how that changes if black moves his bishop to d4. The move forces white's king back to h1, leaving the f1 square unguarded. The movement of the bishop also leaves the black rook with an open line to f1, so rook moves to f1 is checkmate. And of course you also could have seen this by noting the kernel of a discovery for black on the f-file and asking what the pieces involved can do to white's king. White to move. What is the best move? In this variation white has power on the e-file but a challenge in trying to get at black's king. Examining every check, even those that involve large sacrifices, brings queen takes at f7, check. And queen takes rook, check. Into view. Queen takes at f7, check. Leaves white without a decisive follow-up move that holds the initiative. But ask how the board would look after one. Queen takes rook, check. King takes queen. You might notice the classic pattern of a king at the edge of its pawn cover and the kernel of a bishop and rook discovery for white. We saw the same idea a moment ago, or you might just consider any checks you would be able to give with the king on its new square. Either way you find bishop moves to c5, check. Which drives the king back to its original square g8 but now with white's queen and black's rook both off the board. White mates with rook moves to e8. White to move. What is the best move? You see the battery on the d-file almost ready to mate with queen moves to d8 then rook moves to d8, but not quite because black's king guards d8 along with his rook. When you see this pattern the enemy king at the edge of its pawn cover, and so able to defend the mating square you need consider whether the king can be driven back behind its pawn cover with a check along the diagonal. A first thought for white might be to use the queen with a move like queen moves to d7, this would work if d7 weren't guarded by black's queen, but it is. Still, consider all the resources you can use to achieve your goals. Or consider every check. Either way you find one. Bishop moves to h3, check. Requiring black to play king moves to b8. Now comes 2. Queen moves to d8, check. Rook takes queen, 3. Rook takes rook, checkmate. Black to move. What is the best move? Now the current idea from black's side. White's king is at the edge of its pawn cover with black's power aimed down the f-file. If the king could be pushed back into the corner, black would have two attackers aimed at f1 against just one defender, the rook on e1. The classic way to give the king such a push is with diagonal pressure, and black has two pieces available for that purpose, a queen and a bishop. He needs them both, because white has a bishop on b2 poised for counter-attack and indeed ready to take black's queen immediately. Thus black starts with queen moves to d4, check. White must either move his king to h1 or play bishop takes queen, so he goes the latter route, but now black has bishop takes bishop, check. And king moves to h1 is white's only remaining option. The rest is routine. Black plays rook moves to f1, check. Forcing rook takes rook, then rook takes rook mates. White to move. What is the best move? White plays with his checks and sees that one. Rook moves to e8, check. Calls for black to interpose with rook moves to f8, with his king then guarding against rook takes rook. When you see an enemy king doing defensive work like this on its back rank, you know that a check may force it to abandon its defensive role and move back toward the corner. The check can occur midway during a sequence rather than at the start. Thus white follows 1. Rook moves to e8, check. Rook moves to f8 with bishop moves to d5, check. Which requires black to play king moves to h8. Notice that when black interposed his rook he also walked it into a pin of its own so that it can't interpose. Now white has rook takes rook, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? Now the same idea in a setting with some more complexity. In the previous frame the open board and the alignment of white's pieces on the e-file plainly suggested a combination against black's king. Here the makings of mate are a little less obvious but the mechanics are similar. White sees that black's back rank is a bit weak. There is a rook on f8, but again no other black piece is in a position to defend d8 and white has a rook aimed there. White thus starts by eliminating black's rook and smoking out black's king with 1. Queen takes rook, check. Requiring king takes queen. Now white pushes the king back under its pawn cover with 2. Bishop moves to c5, check. Notice that this time the other bishop on b5 does crucial work that was performed in the previous position by the rook on e1, it prevents black's king from escaping onto e8. If black plays king moves to g8, white mates with 3. Rook moves to d8, checkmate. Why if black plays king moves to g8? Because this time black has another option, in reply to bishop moves to c5, check. He can interpose his queen at d6. You might think white could respond by simply renewing the check with bishop takes queen, check. And he can. Notice the power of the move, it wins back the queen, leaving white up a rook. More to the point, it's a pretty bishop fork of black's other rook and his king on its new square. So white sees that he is going to win 2 rooks and is ready to go forward. For all that, though, bishop takes queen, check. Isn't white's best move, for once his bishop has captured on d6 it blocks the rook's path to d8. Now after the black king retreats to g8, this time it's forced, white has no mate. He can move his bishop out of the way by taking the rook on b8, but since that isn't a check it gives black time to play knight moves to d7, again blocking the rook's path and doing it with protection. Nor can white then take the knight with his light squared bishop. The bishop became pinned when black moved his knight. So the even more decisive reply to black's queen moves to d6 is 3. Rook takes queen, pictured in the next frame black. Black to move. What is the best move? Play has gone 1. Queen takes rook, king takes queen, 2. Bishop moves to c5, check. Queen moves to d6, and then 3. Rook takes queen. This last move isn't a check, but with careful play it still gives white a forced mate. 3. King moves to e7, the king tries to escape from the threatened rook moves to d8, checkmate. 4. Our pawn from h1 moves to d1, bringing in reinforcements and threatening mate. Next move with the discovered check, rook moves to f6, knight moves to d5, interposing to block the rook now on d1, and thus preserve e7 as a flight square. 5. Rook moves to d7, check. And now black is about to get mated, though in ways that may be visually unexpected. If he moves his king to e6, for example, white mates with pawn from c4 takes knight, a pawn administers the fatal blow. If black instead moves his king to e8, white plays rook moves to b7, discovering check by the bishop on b5, then if black interposes with bishop moves to d7, white mates with rook takes rook b8. Or black can move his king to d8, in which case white mates most efficiently with bishop moves to e7. Yes, it gets intricate. But in the initial position you might well go forward simply upon observing the 2 rooks 1 by 3. Bishop takes queen. White to move. What is the best move? Applying pressure up close. The same technique we have been studying can work well up close, your bishop or queen makes a capture on f7 or an equivalent square in front of the king. Since your capturing piece has protection, the king must retreat, leaving it unable to defend itself and resulting in mate. In this first example, the queens are faced off against each other. White is at risk of queen takes queen, but in the meantime he pins black's queen and safely can take advantage of the situation by playing the check bishop takes at f7. This has the same effect as the bishop moves examined a moment ago. It forces the king back to h8. The difference is just that instead of moving to the king's diagonal, the bishop already starts there, and uses its move to take out the pawn that had obstructed its path. For this to work, the bishop needs protection against king takes bishop. Here the protection is of course supplied by white's queen. After black moves his king, his queen, and the mating square on which it sits are loose. White plays queen takes queen, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? The current principle can be used by the queen without a bishop. Here white sees the coordination of his queen and rook against f7, and so experiments with attacks by his queen. The check 1. Queen takes at f7 forces king moves to h8, since the queen has protection, and now that black's king has been forced into the corner, it no longer will be able to defend itself. The resulting position has two heavy white pieces trained on the mating square f8 and just one black piece, his rook, available for defense. Thus 2. Queen moves to f8, check. Rook takes queen, 3. Rook takes rook, checkmate. Black to move. What is the best move? Now combine the principles we have been studying with one from earlier, the use of a pawn to seal off the king's flight squares and trap it on the back rank. Here black's pawn on g3 attacks f2 and h2, so white's king is stuck just as it would be if its pawn cover still were in place. Black has a battery of heavy pieces on the e-file, making e1 a potential mating square. White currently defends the square twice, but one of the defenders is his king. We know that when a king defends itself against a back rank mate, it sometimes can be pushed away and made defenseless. A queen can do this especially well from up close, because it has the power to first apply bishop-like diagonal pressure and then add a rook-like vertical attack. Black thus begins with queen moves to e2, check, forcing white to move his king to g1. Now e1 has just one defender, so black exhausts it in standard fashion. First comes queen takes at e1, check. To which white replies rook takes queen, and now black mates with rook takes rook. Black to move. What is the best move? Let's stretch out the current logic a bit. You should see black's rook ready to move to e1, and consideration of the check queen moves to d4 also should be automatic, it's safe, and it forces white to move his king to h1, any check with those properties cries out for careful study. If white instead interposes with rook moves to f2, he walks his rook into a pin, now black mates with rook moves to e1. With white's king pushed into the corner, the remaining question is how to take advantage of his weakened back rank. Rook moves to e1 doesn't work because white's rook still is on f1. And black also has no safe way to move his queen to the first rank. The solution is queen moves to f2, where black plants his queen on the penultimate rank and puts white to a bad choice. If he plays rook takes queen, black mates with rook moves to e1 followed by rook takes rook, after white moves his rook back down to f1. Yet otherwise black threatens queen takes rook, checkmate. Since black's queen moves to f2 isn't a check, white does have a way to avoid mate by generating counterplay at the other end of the board, queen takes at f7, check. Now if black plays king takes queen, white has rook takes queen, check. With the check gaining him the safety of a tempo. So black doesn't play king takes queen. He plays queen takes queen, and now white dares not recapture rook takes queen because then he once again gets mated by black's rook moves to e1. White instead has to let go of his queen and play rook moves to g1, which saves the game for the very immediate future but at catastrophic cost. Playing this one through in your mind's eye a few times is a useful exercise. White to move. What is the best move? As we have seen, it should be second nature to look at a check like one. Queen moves to c4, check. Or queen moves to b3, check, as it loses nothing and forces the king to move and to retreat into the corner, which has the predictable consequence of making a back rank mate more plausible. Black still has his two rooks against one of white's, but here as in the last position moving the queen to the penultimate rank changes the picture dramatically. White plays 2. Queen moves to f7 and now notice that he threatens mate a couple of different ways. If black plays rook takes queen, then white has 3. Rook takes rook e8 plus and mates with rook takes rook after black drops his rook back to f8, the mirror image of the previous problem. It might seem safer for black simply to sit tight, but then white mates on the 7th rank with queen takes at g7. So black might try the final recourse rook moves to g8. The technique doesn't work this time, however, as white plays 3. Rook takes rook e8 and now threatens queen takes rook g8 hashtag. If black plays rook takes rook e8, white has queen takes rook, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? White has two resources, a battery on the f-file and a battery on the 7th rank. The mating square for the vertical formation would be f8, which black guards with his rook, knight, and king. The mating square for the horizontal formation would be g7, at least for starters, which black guards with his knight and king. Experimenting with his checks leads white to 1. Rook takes at g7, check. Black would have to respond by moving his king to h8 or by capturing white's rook with his knight. So black, if black plays king moves to h8, white has a mating pattern of a sort that is standard with two heavy pieces on the 7th rank, 2 rook takes at h7, check. King moves to g8, 3. Queen moves to f7, checkmate. Notice how the queen and rook protect each other while providing overpowering pressure against the king. b. If black instead replies to 1. Rook takes at g7, check. With knight takes rook, now what? White then would have 2. Queen moves to f7, check. Where the queen draws protection from the rook on f1 and therefore pushes the king into the corner in the same way we saw in the previous position. After black's king moves to h8, white has 2 attackers trained on f8 against 1 defender, black's rook. Now 3. Queen moves to f8, check. Rook takes queen, rook takes rook, checkmate. The important point to see from the outset of the position is that if white can get his queen onto f7, it can force the king to h8 and then drop to the back rank to participate in a mating attack. They're a useful idea to have in mind anytime you have a rook and queen both aimed at f7 or a comparable square.